Hi there, this is Eshu. I'm the abbot here at Zenwest Buddhist Society. This Living Zen-podcast is just one of the many resources we've created at Zenwest to make Zen practice and training more available and accessible to people all over the world. Instructional videos, printable resources, and much, much more are also available on our website at www.zenwest.ca. If you're a regular listener, I'd love to hear from you. So please drop me an email at office@zenwest.ca and let me know who you are, how you got started, and what brought you to Zen. Everything we make available in person and online at Zenwest is only possible because of the support of our members and associates, people like you. If the efforts of our community are making a difference in your life, I'd like to invite you to show your support and take part in making it happen by becoming an associate or member of the Zenwest Sangha. You can do this by clicking the Join Us tab on our website at www.zenwest.ca. Thank you for your support, and thanks for listening. So today is our December Sangha Sunday. Thank you all for coming. I didn't get any responses when I asked for members who wanted to give a wayfinding talk today. So I hope it's not a kind of a pressure thing. I hope people don't feel like, oh God, I could never give a talk. It's just telling the story of how you came to practice. It's a personal thing, so I can totally understand, and it's why I don't want to sort of like start tapping people and saying, now you will give the talk next week. It's kind of an optional opportunity. Today is December 1st, and so we have a couple of members, Doshu and Doyu, who have gone down to join the Choboji Sangha for the Rohatsu Dai Session. Rohatsu is traditionally in the Zen school sort of the big sit of the year. Rohatsu means the 8th of the 12th, or the 8th of the last month. December 8th in the Zen tradition is the day we commemorate the historical Buddha Shakyamuni's awakening. And so today, I just want us to sort of bring Doshu and Doyu into our thoughts, into our hearts as they join the Choboji Sangha in the Rohatsu session. Represent all of us down there in Seattle. The story I think by now people who have been around the Zen West for long enough have heard the Buddha's birthday story a number of times. And I think just as important, if not more important, is the story of the Buddha's practice and awakening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Now, with all things Zen, all things Buddhist, we have to understand that there are layers. There is an aspect of the story which is historical. There is an aspect of the story that is legendary. And even within the legendary aspects of the story, there are important teachings, demonstrations, images and ideas. So after the Buddha, I guess we shouldn't call him the Buddha yet, after Siddhartha left home and lived in the woods for a time, he went and practiced with two renowned teachers in India at the time. I think many people often have the idea that the Buddha sort of wandered off into the bush and a little while later kind of emerged this sort of enlightened Buddha with no instruction at all. But this isn't the case at all. He, after leaving home, he met other people who had left home. It wasn't an uncommon thing for people to do this, although it was a bit unusual for someone at Siddhartha's age. I think he was like 29 when he left home. So he met these other people, and he was told about these religious teachers who were gathering communities around them. And his primary focus was on liberation from suffering. He wanted to understand, what is suffering? Where does it come from? How does it arise? And how do you get beyond suffering? How do you liberate yourself? How do you liberate yourself from suffering? What is the path? And so he there were two teachers, and I can't remember offhand which one he went to first. And for today's story, it's not really that important because the results are the same. The two teachers were Udaka Ramaputta and Alara Kalama. And he went to these teachers, and from the beginning they could see that he was really sensitive, perceptive, and quick. And each of them had particular teachings which dealt with the attainment of a refined state of consciousness. And in a relatively short time, the young home leaver Siddhartha was able to accomplish even the most refined state of consciousness that the teacher was teaching about. And when Siddhartha was able to demonstrate this to the teacher recognized this, acknowledged this, and with both of these teachers offered Siddhartha to help sort of co-lead the community or to take over, because in both cases these teachers were quite elderly. But in both cases, Siddhartha responded with the same response. And that was, while the refined state of consciousness, while the refined meditative absorption was deep or powerful or revealing, that in both cases, you couldn't stay there. They weren't permanent and they weren't lasting. And that in the end, when you broke your meditation, or when you sort of returned to the body, then along with the return to the physical realm, along with the return to consciousness, mundane consciousness, came suffering. And in some ways, it was not diminished, but actually increased by having attained this refined state of consciousness. So in both cases, his response was with gratitude for the opportunity, with gratitude for the offer, but to decline in both cases and to say that his pursuit was not of the leadership of a community, that his pursuit was not in pursuit of recognition or admiration or appreciation or position, but liberation from suffering. And it wasn't found yet, and so he didn't feel like he should stop yet. And so he went from one community and then he went to the other. I can't remember the order, as I said. But they both ended up the same way. And he ended up leaving both communities and then retreating into the forest, in the mountains, where a place called Deer Park. where the forest was kind of, known for being a place of meditation, and there were ascetics of all kinds there. And the religious ascetics there were all people who had pursued a similar path to Siddhartha. At some point or other in their life, for one reason or another, they had left home. They had gone off in pursuit of some truth or some spiritual realization. And they didn't all have the same practice by any means, but they certainly recognized practice in one another. They certainly recognized the common factors of practice in one another. And this is something that I think is quite admirable, and I wish there were a little bit more of. I had an interesting conversation with my father last week. I've been practicing Zen for almost 20 years, and my father asked me, he said, "Do you think it's religious?" And I think that's a great question. And whenever I get asked that question, I always have to say, well, how do you define religion? And so he defined it as many people, I think, do in our culture, which is to say, it has to do with believing in some supreme being or something like that. And I once went to a lecture where they were talking about the definition of religion, or how to define and understand religion. And one of the most useful sort of schemes that I heard was, I can't remember the name of the professor, but he describes it like if you look at a picture of a family reunion, every family has characteristics that are similar. And you can look at a picture of a family reunion and say, oh yeah, this is a family reunion, clearly, they all resemble one another. But there's no one individual in the photograph that will possess all of the family's characteristics. And so, likewise, in understanding religion, spiritual practice, there are characteristics. Things like ritual form, things like historical scripture, liturgy, certain kinds of attire, certain kinds of practices, and certain kinds of philosophical questions, beliefs, or understandings. And according to this scheme, sort of theism, or like the belief in external God, is just one of those characteristics. It's like a big nose or funny ears or something, maybe. I don't know. Maybe if it's like skin color, I don't know. And so, understood like this, it really helped me to say, oh, okay, in that context I can understand Buddhism as religion. I don't talk about it like that much because, as I said, most people in North America really, when you say religion, what they mean is sort of a kind of blind faith in an external God. So in this story, these ascetics in the woods recognized companionship or family, I guess you could say, in the other ascetics. And they all practiced differently. Some of them felt like it was appropriate to shave their heads. Some of them felt it was appropriate to grow long, nappy, dreadlock kind of hair. Some of them, and they're still around today, these kinds of forest ascetics. Some of them believed that the way to pursue liberation from suffering was to become so strong, so ironclad of will that you could not be brought to suffer. Even today I've seen pictures of these Indian ascetics that will hold a hand up in the air, and they'll never let it down, just as a matter of developing will. And it gets to the point where their hand literally withers, and the bones just sort of calcify. At night their arm is extended up, in the day their arm is extended up. It never goes down. And this is the practice. Walking on hot coals and hanging upside down from trees and sleeping on spikes, and there's all kinds of different practices that people engaged in. But there was some camaraderie and some communion, some fellowship among these people. Certainly there was a common, in some ways, some common aspects to the ethics and discipline. Certainly clarity of mind played a big role for many of them. Certainly celibacy played a big role for many of them. Siddhartha's particular practice that he took up had to do with the control of desire itself. And this is something I've always found really interesting, was that the Buddha's particular form of practice had to do with food. We have to remember that he came from abundance. He came from a family, wealthy family. We, in our Western sort of minds, we call him a prince, but he was like the son of a tribal chieftain, basically, is a little more honest. But he certainly didn't lack for food or sex or entertainment. And so when he came to practice with these ascetics, the type of practice that he chose to investigate or chose to practice with was food. And his practice, it's said, was to reduce the amount of food that he ate, little bit by little bit, until it got to the point where he was literally eating 1 grain of rice a day. Now, oftentimes this is spoken about just in passing. But this awareness of desire through food is something that, although he gave up the ascetic practices later, it's still his investigation into this desire through food is something that continued even after his awakening. Continues to this day. It's still a part of our form in the Zen tradition. So I always like to sort of not just pass by this too much. Awareness of desire, which comes up later in the Four Noble Truths. So to me, it's like even at this early stage, even before his so-called awakening, he was on to something with this. Now, I think many people who have done the fundamentals course have maybe touched on this a little bit. But a few years ago, I took up a practice that's common in the Theravadan tradition for monks, which is not taking food after the midday meal. So after around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I didn't eat food for 6 months. And what I found was, it was fascinating, really fascinating, because I think more than many other desires, really more than any other desire almost, the desire to eat is powerful. And so paying attention to that desire, controlling the body in relationship with that desire, had a profound effect on me. And it had a profound effect, what I learned, or what I found, is that it had a profound effect on other desires to do things. It was overwhelming. The desire to eat, particularly in our culture in which food is everywhere and everything, all the time. We can't go and meet a friend without there being food involved. We can't go out shopping for something even without having to stop for a snack or, grabbing something on the way. It's very difficult. One of the most difficult aspects for me personally was just maintaining my relationship with the family, because there was so much social interaction around the dinner table. And it got to the point where literally I sat at the table with the family and they got used to me just not eating with them. But I had to sit there and be with them. It was difficult. And so Siddhartha didn't give up eating. This is what I find really interesting. He didn't give up eating. He kept reducing it and reducing it and reducing it, but always eating something. And when I think about my own experience with practice, and I'm sure anybody here who's been on a diet or had to watch what they're eating for medical reasons or anything like that, knows how difficult it is to eat something, but not as much as you really want to eat. Or to have something, but just not be able to have all of the rest of this that's offered or that's available. So Siddhartha took up this practice of 1 grain of rice a day. And it's said that he maintained this for a long time. So much so that the other ascetics in the woods began to really admire him and were kind of amazed by his discipline, by his strength, by his determination, by his will. As his body wasted away. The descriptions in the sutras of the Buddha when he was sort of coming to the end of this practice are kind of frightening. And there's a really, it's one of my favorite spiritual images, really, is there's this great statue of the Buddha sort of in this process where it's just like you can completely see all of his like ribs and bones, and his eyes are all sunken in. It's kind of scary looking, but you know me. It's said that the descriptions are like his hair was falling out, his eyes were sunken in, his navel rested on his spine. That's how sort of skinny it was. You could like see his organs working. So the story is that he went down to the river to wash. And when he got into the river, just the current which was entirely mild, he was so weak that he fell. And he was barely able, because of the weight of the clothing that he had on, was barely able to sort of drag himself to the shore. And he pulled himself up on the shore and just kind of collapsed there. And had this thought arise in his mind that in this moment I could die. Not because of external circumstances, but because the only thing holding, the only thing maintaining life in his body at that moment was will to live. And he realized that with a breath, with just the simple will, he would be dead immediately. But he also realized, just as he had realized before with the two teachers, that he had not realized what he had sought. That in spite of the tremendous will that he had developed, there was still this dukkha, this fundamental dissatisfaction with things. And it was at that point, they say, that a young girl who was coming through the village, from the village, to make an offering to forest spirits. And so she had a bowl of rice and milk. And when she saw Siddhartha, she thought he was a corpse, first of all. She thought he was just another crazy dead hermit. But he started to move, and so she thought that he might be a forest spirit. And so she offered him this rice and milk. And it said that in the realization that he had taken that ascetic practice to its extreme conclusion and had come up empty, it said this is where the sort of beginning of the middle path began to open. And so he received the milk and rice and drank it, I'm imagining, slowly. And it said that this sort of happened over the course of a week or so. And this girl kept coming back and giving him food, and he started to regain his strength. And the ascetics, there were 5 of them, saw this, and they renounced Siddhartha. They said, "Oh, he had such promise. He was doing so well, and now look at him, eating rice and milk, the life of luxury. He's gone back and he's living so indulgently." And so Siddhartha, as he recovered, was taking shelter under this big Bodhi tree. And in one of my favorite sort of parts of the story, he's kind of reflecting on his entire life and his spiritual path and all of the different practices that he's done and all of the different meditations that he's learned and spiritual insights that he's had. And he comes upon a memory that he had of when he was just a child. And it was the spring festival, sort of the farmers' festival, and there were it's a big party, and the idea is that the king goes down, and the Brahmin go down, and they bless all the fields, and there's races with plow horses and things like that, and the king gets behind a plow and plows a furrow in the field, and it's the spring festival. And Siddhartha was left under a rose apple tree, I think with some relatives, and he remembered just sort of sitting upright and paying attention to his breath. And he remembered seeing the plowing going on and seeing that insects and worms were being cut apart by the plows. And then he saw that the birds would come down and eat the bugs and the worms. And he remembers feeling really deep pain or deep sadness at the loss of the worms, but also kind of a happiness for the joy of the birds. But most of all, I better wrap this up. We're not even halfway there. Most of all, he remembered this state of breathing, balance. And this is where he took up this teaching of the middle way. And he made this decision to practice between the life that he had from his youth, one of indulgence and excess and access to everything one could want, indulgence in everything that was offered, and this life that he had found later, which was one of extreme asceticism, denial, harshness. And once he had found his strength and come across, established this path, this attitude, this direction of the middle way, he sat under this tree and said, I'm going to practice here until I realize what I have sought. And it doesn't matter if I die, it doesn't matter if it rains, it doesn't matter what happens. I'm not leaving this spot until I've realized it. And it said that for 7 days he sat under that tree. Now there's all kinds of different stories. The more sort of bombastic stories say that, he just sat 7 days, no eating, no sleeping, no nothing. But I personally find that would be a bit odd after this whole middle way thing. I know I'm going to take up the middle way, which means I won't sleep or eat or move. It doesn't sound right to me. Another way of understanding it is that he sort of like created what we call now the Bodhi Mandala, the seat of awakening, which is, he said, this is my home, this is my practice area, and I'm not going to leave here until I realize this. I suspect that probably this young girl kept bringing him food, providing him with nourishment for his practice. The stories about what happened under the tree are really bombastic and wonderful, legendary stuff. But I think they're great to look at from the context of our own practice. It said that very quickly, as soon as he made this kind of vow, I'm not leaving, this other person showed up, Mara. And we chant, chant about, the people who are like this are, belong to the family of Mara. And if there's a devil in Buddhism, it's Mara. I always think of Mara as like the shadow, the Buddha's shadow. And I think of Mara as each of us has a Mara, and it looks just like us. And Mara's primary concern was that awakening would be a bad thing to happen. Liberation would be a bad thing to happen. Realizing that we can be happy and liberated from suffering would cause Mara a lot of problems. And so when he shows up, he says, Siddhartha, you've really worked very hard. Don't you think it's time to just get on with your life and, get a job, give up this craziness? I mean, your legs must hurt. I mean, gosh, the things you must have done to your organs with that whole 1 grain of rice a day thing. And the Buddha doesn't respond. The Buddha just continues to practice. Now, this is sort of an external personification of something I think we all have. When we practice, we do these Sunday sits, Tuesday sits, before sits. When we wake up in the morning, there's this voice that arises and says, yeah, I agree, practice is kind of good, but God, doesn't that feel nice to just lay in bed? Wouldn't you rather? I'm sure there's some good cartoons on this morning. We all have it. And then it said when the Buddha doesn't move, that things sort of Mara ups the ante a little bit. And the Buddha starts to have visions of his family being killed, and he thinks, maybe I should go back and make sure that they're safe, or see if there's something that I can do. Wars and diseases and famines and plagues, all of this floats through the Buddha's mind. Mara putting on a royal display of all the reasons why Siddhartha really should get off his ass and go do something. But Siddhartha recognizes it as the efforts of Mara and continues to practice. And then Mara again brings forth a bigger game, calls forth his daughters. And this is one of my favorite parts in the story is, then, all of these beautiful naked orgy scenes sort of appear in front of the Buddha. Lots of food, decadent, being served by, beautiful. And if any of us have done any significant amount of practice, we've all met the daughters of Mara, whether they manifest as the sons of Mara, the daughters of Mara, and it's actually quite remarkable how accurate they are in manifesting our deepest desires as we sit. Wouldn't it be great if we could just get off our asses and go have that? But again, Siddhartha ignores it. It doesn't even react to it. Just continues his practice. And then Mara became really frustrated and challenged the Buddha, says, what right do you think you have to become awakened? And it said that the Buddha reached down and touched the earth, and the earth shook in sort of testimony for the depth of his practice. And that's one of the most common sort of representations of the Buddha you see is this earth-touching mudra or manifestation. And this represents overcoming temptation, overcoming distraction, overcoming obstacles, the groundedness of the Buddha's, Siddhartha's wisdom. And it said with that, Mara was defeated and disappeared. And on the morning of the 8th day, Rohatsu, the morning star, I think it's Saturn, rose in the sky, and seeing it, the Buddha had his great realization. Wonder of wonders, fundamentally all things are awake. All beings are already awake, and we don't realize it. There's not much, it doesn't go into much detail about sort of like what the Buddha realized, quote unquote, because this is a realization. This is the awakening of the Buddha. And it said that right after his awakening, Mara showed up again and said, "Wow, that's awesome. Ready to die?" And it said that the Buddha really thought about this. Said, well, yeah, I've kind of accomplished what I set out to do. I figure I can die now. And then it said that another spiritual being arrived named Brahma, who said, but don't you think, and there was like a debate, don't you think that there might be a few other people that you might be able to explain this to, that you might be able to teach this to? And Mara said, no way. It's too complex. It's too hard. But eventually, Brahma won out. And we can look at this as external beings, again, or we can look at this as just the voices within ourselves. Or if you want to sort of make it a comic, I mean, it's like, the little devil and the little angel that look just like you. Nah, give it up, die now. No, I think that maybe there may be some people who can... Eventually, Siddhartha, now the Buddha, the awakened one, decided that it might be good to teach, that there would be people who would understand this easily. And that is, it said that he took some time after his awakening, because the biggest problem he had after his awakening was, but what do I say? How do I express this? How do I tell somebody about this? And it said that he continued to sit under the Bodhi tree for a week in some stories, or 2 weeks in some stories, or 3 months in some stories, before he was ready to depart. And the story goes on. He returns to his 5 ascetic friends that had abandoned him and written him off. And it said when they saw him coming, they said, "Hey, look, it's that bum Siddhartha. Let's ignore him," like a pack of high schoolers or something, Yeah, let's just pretend he doesn't exist. But when he came up to them, his countenance had changed so profoundly that they couldn't even help themselves. They set up a seat and asked him about his practice and his teaching. And this is the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. It's the turning of the wheel of the Dharma Sutra. It's the first teaching of the Buddha that we hold as the first teaching of the Buddha, setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. But that's where I'll end today. Thank you for your patience, and sorry for talking for so long. Thanks for listening to the Living Zen podcast. If you follow Living Zen through iTunes, I would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to let me know what you think about it by rating or reviewing the podcast, so that new listeners can also hear what you have to say. Thank you for your time and for your support.